With this evening's meeting, we are going to start an important line of debates and encounters in this meeting that is focused on earning the heritage, the legacy. And I would like to tell you about how we came up with this line of encounters and conferences. First of all, I would like to introduce our guest, though there's no need for presentations actually. We do this at least to express our gratitude to Mr. Luciano Violante. Mr. Luciano Violante doesn't really need to be introduced. He's very well known. Well, he doesn't need introductions in general, and he doesn't need introductions here at the meeting in particular. Anyway, I am very pleased to thank him, also mentioning some biographical data about him. So I'm doing so, even if his presence has been so intense in the history of the meeting and also in the history of our country that it's really superficial. It's not really necessary to do this. Anyway, Luciano came to the meeting in 2010 for the first time. He didn't come in 2011, and then he came again to talk about laws, civil situations, living together. And then after 2015, something new happened. After a series of meetings that occurred between us, he said, well, why don't we create something that may be useful to let young people know what they do not know about? And young people do not know about history. This year's meeting is about heritage, but young people do not know about history, so he said, why don't we do something to let people know more about Italy? And that's how the exhibition about the 70 years started, and all the meetings and conferences linked to that exhibition. It is a pleasure for me to recall all these memories and tell you about these things, because it's really nice to know how today's conference has been conceived, because it's basically talking about what the meeting is. That is, getting together and being aware that the meeting is the result of true friendship, of exchanges, of people's experiences, of people like Luciano Violante. He's a great person, and he's becoming part of our own history, a history that we are building together. So there is a mutual interest, a mutual respect, and that's the way the meeting event is organized. It is not decided in closed doors, but it's a crossing of histories and experiences. And I do believe that this is actually the only useful thing that the meeting can really offer us. Otherwise, it would make no sense to get together all these days. It would be enough to just to write books and publish books to disseminate ideas, but what does the meeting add to this? It is a moment in which people exchange something, share something. So a space is built in which other people can also get together. They can reach such a space. They can benefit from such a space, and that's why it is such a nice experience. When we get together with people talking about history and exchanging this history with men, well, gratitude becomes really, really big, and I'm very grateful to Luciano for his availability and for all this. After the exhibition of the 70 years, what has happened? Well, we started to think about the title of today's meeting, the need to earn one's heritage. We started to wonder over what could be considered under this main theme. And In our common job, what has always struck me is what I call a kind of ethical tension that is present in Luciano Violante and that never stops. This ethical tension has not to do with behavior, it has to do with truth, never giving up in looking for the truth, pursuing justice, looking for the good. I'm sorry to talk about you, Luciano, but I can't stop this. Well, basically, what you're doing is a necrology, is an obituary. Oh, no, not at all. I said I was really, really pleased to introduce you because I'm very happy to mention these things because it makes sense to say these things, actually. Because, in my view, our friendship has started on this basis. And I think that the sense behind this friendship is exactly this, that I've been learning from all of this and we can share this learning with other people. So, as I said, this year we have started to think about this theme or where we are, what's going on, and immediately we came across this issue of the epical change. Before the question, let us try to understand how can we understand, how can we know more to let other people know and understand themselves. So in trying to start understanding, we asked ourselves, what is this time? What is going on? What is this epochal change about? What are we talking about? Well, the term epochal change has become a kind of a buzzword, but what is the meaning? And that's where more ideas, evaluations, assessments, and themes started to crop up. So, the first question I would like to share is, what is this epochal change about, and why is this topic so interesting? Thank you, and good evening. It is really nice to be here because I have the feeling it is one of the few places where there can be an exchange as far as values are concerned, which is something that really is lacking in our country. And so, a place like this should be preserved because, coming from different origins and places, the idea of being able to have a dialogue together and address things together, I think it's a really, really great result in our life. So, building among different people. So, what is this epochal change about? This kind of view was first offered in 2016 by Pope Francis, talking in Florence to the Italian bishops. He warned them in this sense. He said, well, this is not an epoch of changes, it is the change of an epoch. And so, if there is a change of an epoch, behavioral changes are also needed as a consequence. So, what is an epochal change? That's not the first time it happens. When America was discovered, that was an epochal change. Consider all the countries facing the Atlantic Ocean. France, Portugal, Spain, and the UK had great advantages. The Mediterranean became a kind of a peripheral lake, and so the whole routes of business just were displaced to that area of the world. And when electricity was discovered, that was another epochal change. Steam machines were also another epochal change. So, to answer Emilia's answer, we can refer to these examples. But now, the fact is that there are more factors of change that are emerging. Some of them are the result of human beings' actions, others are the result of weather change and other natural factors. The first changes see men and women as protagonists. The second kinds of change instead gives men and women not such a prominent role. Let us consider the first kind that is linked to the global dimension. For the first time in half of the world population is online, is connected, is has never happened in the history of humanity. Billions of people can now communicate at the same time. They can exchange information, swap pictures and contents. That's something new. Then consider that today the most efficient means to communicate in Italy by young people, in 73% by young people and 73% by young girls, is the mobile phone. So it's easier to communicate via a short text message than talking to each other directly. So people talk much less than they do communicate via messages sent with a phone. And this brings about crisis of dialogue, because when people talk to each other, there is a dialogue, and that kind of messaging, virtual messaging, has an effect, and it is brought by the modernization of this kind of communication. So the word decreases, and also profound thinking decreases at the same time, because if you realize what counts is to be readily available to intervene in the network. 1 second after that, it's not important anymore, because so many people has already said something. So it's really hard to express something profound. So the web, the net, is the place of immediate thinking, superficial thinking. So this is a banal kind of thinking. And this, for sure, is a problem for communication. And then there is confusion between knowledge and getting information. Well, knowledge entails going deeper into a subject and also questioning it and creating a form of wisdom. Instead, the network gives us the idea that information is enough, but time is managed in a very different way, because as soon as we read a piece of news, this is already made old by another piece of news that is published immediately. So again, this runs the risk of making everything so banal. And there is the problem here of the creation of public opinion. Public opinion has been traditionally based on oral tradition, discourse, newspapers, and so on and so forth. However, when public opinion is based on the network, on the web, the effects are totally different. You see that in the United States, there is a process going on that has been where the state has been involved and President Trump is involved, because there seemed apparently there has been manipulation by Russian subjects of public opinion. In Germany, recently, a law has been published on manipulation of public opinion on the part of third parties during electoral campaign, because there are fears about this. And since the votes in a democracy are formed by the public opinion, if there is a force, factor that can distort such an opinion, well, the subject provoking such a distortion controls the democratic process and the public opinion. So this is a truly epical change in this sense. Then there is another point that should be mentioned. The GDP in historical societies depending on a couple of factors: raw materials and energy. Today, 70% of the GDP of the G7 countries, the richest countries in the world, that is Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, Japan, and the United States, 70% of the GDP is the result of intangible goods. It's not raw materials, it's not energy, these are intangible goods that depends on ICT, information and communication technology. You see that even production has changed dramatically. Third point, some months ago, I was at the Italian chamber. I invited a mathematician who works in the Silicon Valley in the United States and who created the UNO platform, YWNO, which creates concepts. When you write a word on Yahoo, such as leopard, as a result, you get the animal and also the tank, which is called leopard. But this machine is able to make a distinction and understand whether you're talking about the animal or the tank. And then that gentleman read us this poem, and he said, "This is a poem by Montale, Italian poet Montale. Do you like it?" Well, actually, Montale didn't write this poem. It was an algorithm that wrote it, and we told the algorithm to write a poem as if it were Montale who wrote it. So what is this algorithm? What is this platform? This is a platform that can create a new concept. This poem was not available before, but it exists after that, so it has been created. So we are now before a non-human thinker. So there is the human thinker, that is us, and there is a non-human thinker which is able to think. Have you heard the news about the two Facebook robots a couple of weeks ago? The two robots started to have an exchange to communicate between each other using an unknown language, a language that was not known to the designers, that was not existing before that moment, which the robot found was more useful to communicate instead of English. Obviously, the technicians couldn't understand what the two robots were saying, and that's quite worrying. In fact, the experiment was stopped and the two robots were not allowed to communicate. So, this is non human thinking, non human thinkers. This is a thinker who is able to find immediately a better and faster way to communicate. A further point concerns biologists. Biologists are about to create new genetic interventions that can take action on the diseased genes so as to heal it. As long as this is used to cure diseases, that's fine. But here there is a big ethical risk. If one day we consider that being short and fat is an illness, what would happen? Would we generate only tall and slim children? So this is creating big responsibilities in terms of managing powers and scientific knowledge. So this is changing our epoch. Then there are other factors, external factors. The first external factor I would like to mention concerns migration. Great migration flows have always existed, but the traditional migrations were unidirectional from Europe to the United States or to Australia, full stop. If you look at this map, the great migrations took place everywhere in the world, in the Americas, in Southeast Asia, between Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. There is no continent where there was no migration. Another important point about migration is this. Whereas in the past, migrants would move towards regions that were not so much inhabited by people. If you remember Western movies, I like Western movies, there were all the people moving towards areas that were not inhabited by other people, but now the new migrations are towards areas that are already inhabited by so many people, so there is the risk of starting new social conflicts. These are the cities with the biggest number of inhabitants, the highest number of inhabitants, but what I want to show you is this, the walls in the world. The walls have increased a lot. There will be a conference on Wednesday about this. I believe that we should really think about this. In view of migration flows, the answer is being frightened, fear. This is what has this is what happened at the Greek Macedonia border, here at the border between Austria and Germany, here at the border between Austria and Slovenia. And this is what happened 70 years ago. Of course, things are different, but the eyes of these people really struck me. They are very similar to those eyes at the frontier, that they were waiting for an answer that has never arrived. This kind of migration is calling something into question. For the citizens, this migration is calling into question identity and welfare. The welfare system that is working for 60 million people cannot work for many more people. So it forces us to rethink everything. There cannot be space for policies of the walls, of the barriers. I think we are really the only country that is trying to react in a serious way to hold this. But this is one of the processes that is causing this epoch making change. It is not enough to host, to welcome. We're not talking about process management here. So the problems are really, really serious. Then the other thing that was also mentioned by Emilia this morning in her opening statement when we started the meeting this afternoon is related to the terrorist attacks. What is the difference between this terrorism and the terrorism that we used to know in the past? This is a global terrorism that can strike everywhere, in the Philippines, in the United States, in Spain, in France, the Great Britain, everywhere. The same subject, the same subject may strike everywhere. And the factor that complicates things is that the people organizing an attack does not necessarily belong to the very same organization of the people organizing attacks in other places, because communication takes place via messages. They send the messages are sent, and then somebody will take it, will get it. So immigration and terrorism are two very different processes. There should be no confusion. But these two processes are not being managed. We're not able to manage these processes at the moment. We have to admit this. The other factors I mentioned are the result of human intelligence, but they also raise risks that should be governed. There is a problem of accountability and responsibility towards these innovations. So this is the first part I wanted to present in response to your question. So what does epoch-making change mean? This is what is entailed, the relations, the production methods, and the way to communicate. These are the basics of our society. And how does this have an impact on democracy? Should I move to the second part? Oh, yes, of course, but I would like just to add something. It's just a short piece of news. All this process and change has been interpreted into three different areas. One is about democracy that we are about to listen now. Another area concerns migration, which we have referred to, and we'll have Tuesday with demographer Livi Bacci, who will talk about this. And then the third one will concern economies with the treasurer of the exchequer of Italy's bank, Visco. So there is a kind of continuity between these conferences to understand what is going on. So you may go on now. How does all this have an impact on democracy? As I said before, there is an impact on the creation of public opinion. that is a fundamental factor. If there is somebody who is able to shape public opinion, then this subject really has a lot of power. The ruling class is now thinking that it is not really necessary to create public opinion. They want to check what citizens think about and then follow through. So they don't really work for creating thinking. But what does that mean? That the public opinion may be created outside the network, those channels I mentioned before. In fact, there is no courage here to defend one's opinion. A politician may have an opinion, but if consensus moves towards another direction, then they are ready to change. They are not ready to fight to insist on their opinions. An example, we have a law in our penal system whereby illegal migration is fined. So there is a lot of court hearings that are very expensive, but they are useless because the migrant people involved do not have any money. And by the end of the hearing, who knows where the people involved are. So there's been a debate about this, and this norm was proposed to be changed into an administrative norm and not on a penal norm. And the person in charge at that time said no because believed that Italian people would have not understood this. Well, of course they don't understand if you don't explain, because the role of the leading class is to let people learn, let people create their opinion. If you are ruling a country on the basis of polls, well, that's a pretty loser game. Of course, we need to consider on what the poll is based. So it's a very complex system, but now there seems to be more interest in following public opinion rather than influencing, forming public opinion. Whereas a serious politician should try to form, to shape public opinion, should really try to put his or her skills at stake. The other point in this regard is that what is likely, probable, prevails over what is true. What people used to say in during Berlusconi's term was that President Merkel had an agreement with President Napolitano to overthrow Berlusconi. And so on the news, on the TV news of that day, what the journalist said was that there are apparently rumors on the fact that Merkel tried to overthrow Berlusconi with Napolitano. So what do you think? Was asked to a politician. And the politician said, well, the news was not confirmed, so what can I say? Maybe it's not true. And the point was raised that it was not true, but it was likely, it was probable. So a commentary had to be made on a probable piece of news. But sometimes lies are more intriguing than the truth. A couple of weeks ago, an assistant of mine called me to tell me that there was a piece of news about Rome's mayor, Mrs. Raggi. And the news was that apparently she issued a decree whereby people were forbidden to kill female mosquitoes. I was really surprised and couldn't believe such a piece of news. Of course, it was a fake news, but a lot of people circulated it. And I'm referring to a subject who belongs to a different political area from mine, but how can this poor person defend herself from this? Who would start to circulate the counter news saying, no, this is not true, versus this piece of news that is not true, but it is so intriguing. So we got to the point where what is probable or likely prevails over what is true. The other day I was talking to some friends. We were exchanging views on Donald Trump, and it's interesting what President Trump is doing with his messages, because he is destroying the truth. Truth does not count. What exists insofar as it is communicated. So what counts is communication. And if there's nothing underpinning it, no problem. It is communication that creates truth. It is not truth that creates communication. This is a total overturn, and it is so risky. So I would really like to draw your attention to this and its effects on democracy. The other effects concern speed. Democracy is a slow process. It is not fast. Some time ago, former President of the United States, Obama, was discussing the intervention in Syria and had to hear the opinion of the Republican part of the chamber and also the Senate. There had a majority of Republicans who said no to an intervention. He also referred to some scholars in America to understand whether he, as commander-in-chief, would have been entitled to start a military action, and the doctrine didn't find a consensus. And at the time, President Putin went to Syria, bombarded there, freed Palmyra, and organized a conference there. And Obama was still there, trying to understand whether that was feasible or not. So the problem of speed is fundamental today, and democracy has problems because of this, because democracy cannot be fast. It has to be as fast as possible, but it cannot be as fast as an authoritarian system. Then I will tell you why this is not good. The other point I would like to introduce is that safety prevails over freedom. You saw the pictures of the borders with barriers. The Pope rightly said the other day that we should welcome the other as long as it is possible. As long as it is possible. But many times people react with fear. Today, the president of the council has made a hint, and he did that also during an interview about the law of jus soli. You know, there is a big debate about it, but it's important that somebody reads that piece of law, because it has nothing to do with jus soli. Jus soli means having the right to citizenship where a person is born. This is the case in the United States and in Australia, because those countries needed citizens, so they said, okay, let's give citizenship to all the people who come and are born here. But such a law entails a very complicated process, which is right that it is controlled. It's not just enough to be born here. One has to go through a certain process. But citizens do not really have the time to read laws from the beginning to the end, but it's something that has to be done. And if this activity is not performed, the idea of safety may prevail over security, over freedom, over democracy, over solidarity. That is why today we truly need to go back to have a dialogue with the citizens. Television is fine, but how can you express yourself in 40 seconds? Then you have the counterpart who is stopping you, interrupting you, and there is a fight basically going on. And the only winner is the one who has the most clever statement. And the other point refers to the new cultural model that is based on fine. You see that punishment is being mentioned more and more. If there is a car accident, then there must be a punishment. If there is an illegal migrant, there must be a punishment. But punishment actually thorns. It doesn't really solve problems. Well, it is necessary in some respects, but the rule of law in a society is obtained by means of persuasion, not by punishment. It is a mistake if we think that by punishing we will get back to order. Spread punishment is a sign of disorder in society, of unrest in society, because there is a lack of direct persuasion so that the citizens' behavior comply with the laws. Punishment should be the last resort, not the starting point. But in these uncertain times, many people think that punishment should be implemented even more. These changes are particularly attractive because of the time of weakening democracy we are going through. These data show registration to parties, political parties, as a member.
And this is about vote participation. Well, if there is a sort of drop in the interest of people towards politics and parties, then as a consequence, we have a drop in the voting rate. Well, then democracy becomes a pure government technique. Well, I'll make an example. When Afghanistan was invaded, Condoleezza Rice had an interview with the New York Times and said, well, there are no big issues there because in Afghanistan and in Iraq will happen what happened in Germany and Italy after the collapse of Nazism and fascism. So, after dictatorships, democracies somehow thrived and established themselves. But democracy has been a topic here for thousands of years. This is not the case in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's not because you get rid of dictatorship that you get democracy. If there is no legacy, if there is no history about that, no culture. So, what do I mean when I say that democracy is a pure government technique? That means that freedom of expression, the religious expression, the religious freedom, the separation of powers just disappear. I mean, all these things disappear if democracy becomes a pure government technique, if the parliament does its thing and the executive power does that thing, that becomes something purely functional. So, democracy can't be a pure government technique. It needs to be aimed at reinforcing values like basic freedoms and rights and pluralism and so on and so forth. Secondly, we see a sort of loss of the memory and legacy of democracy. I see many young faces in the room, and certainly these young people just heard about the history of Italian democracy. Well, my father was a communist, and somehow I was born in a concentration camp, and fascists and anti-fascists were imprisoned in a camp after the Ethiopian campaign. But still, I think that my generation was the first that was fully educated in under the Republic. I was born in 41, but I still remember the bombing, I still remember somehow suffering from hunger. But young people today do not have a clue about that. I mean, there's no memory of that. There's no such rooted memory of democracy because nobody told them so. But even people in their 50s do not have such memory, and this is a fact. We can't help it. But somehow, democracy cannot be taken for granted, not at all. Democracy does not exist in nature, it is a result of the willingness of being free and of intelligence. No herd, no cattle is democratically organized. No population get born naturally with the democratic regime. So, being something created by man, it is something that also needs to be nurtured and taken care of. And so people need to be aware of what they're doing, of its importance, of its history, of its legacy. Well, what are the results of this lack of memory of democracy? Well, first of all, the fact that many people today think that what is most important is to win, not to govern. Well, if people just think about what is purely technical, well, victory becomes the only thing that counts. And I think now about the journal of Kierkegaard, a very important philosopher who said in his diaries, wrote in his diaries, we were on a ship, but the cook took charge of it. And from that on, we didn't get any information, neither about the route nor about the port. We were simply being read the daily menu. So when somebody who is not skilled about a task and can't live up to a certain standard, well, this is the result. So if a cook takes control of a ship and doesn't care about the route, but simply still about daily menu, well, this means that skills are not important any longer. And so, if what counts is the victory only, well, then it doesn't matter which team you have, it doesn't matter which players you have. And again, if what matters is to govern, well, then the contents are important. But now you see that it's increasingly difficult to understand the real program and the real intentions of a political party today when there is an electoral campaign because everybody just wants to win and not to govern. So politics becomes a game, becomes something that seems to have lost sight of its principles and values. So values are lacking, values have been lost. In other words, what do we need? We need today a leader who needs to be seductive, appealing, and narcissistic enough. So the community doesn't matter. And you're great because you are a community relying on horizontal relations, so the relations and the bonds between and among you. You're not behind a leader. You are the protagonist of your own lives and stories. You haven't asked a third party to tell your story, to experience your story. On the contrary, in the political world, we are experiencing a completely different process. And this is an international phenomenon that has to do with the Western world, not just with Italy. So everybody is looking for a boss, for a leader that is not really interested in representing the others. And so leaders today do not really want to represent a certain kind of society, not at all. Leaders simply look for those who are like them. So somehow, similarity becomes the key driver. So everybody has to conform. And so the party becomes simply a sort of token symbol. So everything is very superficial. And this is the kind of risk democracy is running into. And then there is a constant delegitimization. I found a beautiful text by Gramsci where he writes, so people tend to despise their opponents. And this is a sign of inferiority. Well, when you want to despise your opponent, it's simply because you want to be sure to get over him, to win over him. So, usually, this attitude shows a certain inability because if I insult my opponent, it's because I cannot somehow face him. So, this is a proof of weakness. The, the legitimization of parliaments and politics resulting from certain attitudes of deputy members are extremely serious when deputies and or politicians attack and criticize democracy are very dangerous. When so the last conferences were delivered by politicians, well, when politicians give up their role, their civilian role, they stop being representatives of the people. I mean, otherwise, parliamentary members become simply sort of people who get a salary for going into an office. So the problem is that, I mean, if politicians become certainly just employees of the state, everything stops. In 1924, Hitler said about the parliament what some current politicians in Italy say about the Italian parliament. We need to be extra careful because the parliament is the only place where a people can be represented. That's the one and only place. There's no other. So when a parliament is delegitimized, well, there are no many choices left. And therefore, we should be worried by the fact that what Hitler wrote in 1924 worryingly sounds up to date because that echoes things that we still hear today. And additionally, the results of the Enlightenment are disappearing. We're going through a neo-romantic phase. I'll tell you why. The boss is what counts, the leader, as during Romanticism. So it's no more about internationalism, but it is about individual countries and nations. So emotions and feelings seem to be more important as well as the show and not the content, not the reason. Heroes seem to be prevailing and be more meaningful. When there was the anniversary of the tragedy of Capaci, I realized that actually many people do not know much about what the victims did. Many people died because of those tragedies, but actually these people did remarkable things. Decided to fight against mafia, and they had understood that mafia is a monolithic structure that needs to be fight against in a consistent way, and that money is the key, because if you hit organized crime in their financial resources, you can hit them hard. And these people, these judges who were murdered, were heroes because they had found a new way to fight against organized crime. But sometimes looking for heroes is a weakness, because that makes our reason stop working, because what counts is not what these people really made. But believe me when I say that these people did all that not because they wanted to become heroes, but simply because they wanted to really beat the mafia and strengthen our civilization. But if you emphasize heroes too much, you then lose sight of the importance of their work and contribution. All these elements tell us that we're going through some dangerous neo-romantic times, because after the romantic age we had Nazism and fascism, so we had totalitarianism, we had dictatorships, and as I said, democracies do not and cannot be killed. They usually commit suicide. And the little democracy that we had in the 20s in Italy died because of fascism. And divisions, separations prevailed. In Germany, the same happened. So, how can we somehow save democracy? Well, I'll now move to the third and last part of my speech. So, democracy does not exist naturally. It is the result of intelligence, reason, the, the desire to be free. So, democracy needs to be nurtured, needs to be taken care of. Well, but what does it mean? In other words, behaviors are key. The respect we have for other people. This afternoon, I was talking to some friends, and I said, if we were to ask something to politicians today, we could say, okay, guys, we ask you just one thing. Please respect yourselves, respect each other, and respect institutions. Because if you do not respect, you cannot be respected. You can't ask to be respected if you do not respect first. So this is something mutual, and this applies also to citizens, not just to politicians. Secondly, it is very important to have politicians understand the value and power of compromise and finding somehow solutions. And somehow it is always important to try to understand other people's point of view, trying to find ways out to find common solutions, shared solutions. This is the only way to overcome difficulties. So, we really have to do our best in order to turn these times into time of crisis, from a time of crisis into transitional times. At the end of a passage, you always have something new. When you overcome a crisis, you get to something new. So we need to be the creator of this passage. We need to support this passage. And are we expecting somebody coming in and making a miracle? Are we waiting for a miracle? Well, we should not. Politicians have duties, but citizens have duties as well and can play a key role. There can't be any democracies without citizens, without accountable citizens. And democracies are socially based systems based on behaviors and not just based on politicians. I've been learning a lot from you over the years. I also read the biography of Don Giussani. I read what Mr. Caron said and wrote. And I think that being Christian is also a matter of expressing certain values through certain behaviors. So it is possible to understand the values expressed by a person through their behaviors. Well, by the way, if the values we believe in are not expressed by our behaviors, well, then what? I mean, behaviors are key, are crucial, because they represent what we are and what we believe in. We need to be more aware as citizens of our duties, of the behaviors we should have. Some people could object. What do behaviors have to do with all that? Well, they have to do a lot because forests stem from seeds. Not all seeds are fruitful. Not all seeds can turn into plants and trees, but many do. Otherwise, we would not have forests and woods. Well, I believe we should recover a certain human side of society. Well, Emilia, while I was preparing this talk, I realized the connection between man and soil. It's not just about the commonly shared linguistic roots in Latin, not just that. In the Jewish tradition, Adam means soil. Adaman, soil, and Adam, man. So soul and man match in the Jewish tradition. In according to the Islamic tradition, we see that again we have similar images. So we see that, Allah creates man by using soil, by using earth. In the old Egyptian cosmology, man comes from earth again, but also in some old Inca tales, men always come from earth. So their origin is in earth, they stem from earth. So this match between humanitas and homos is a fact. This is a conceptual deduction, but let's be careful because the origin of words is very important because words come from facts, from things, from objects. The fact that in many cultures all around the world, the word man comes from the word earth is key. And there is another key word, humbleness. And the words man, Earth and humbleness share the same roots. And Earth is not imposing like nature, like rivers. And Earth somehow is very sort of simple and basic. It's powerful, but it shows humility. It can do incredible things, like man. In the first part of Antigone, the choir sings, man can do great things. And so humanity needs to be fertile to produce, but in order to be so, it needs to be nurtured. So both man and earth needs to be constantly nurtured and taken care of. Nobody can be left alone or can be left behind. Nurturing requires specific behaviors. And from this point of view, this year's meeting's theme underscores the connection between generations. Those who despise the fathers will be despised by their children. Those who break the relations with their fathers will have children who are going to break the relations with them. Those who honor their fathers will be honored by their children. No generation can start from scratch again. No generation has to be forced to start from scratch again and to forget what happened before. I say it because there has been a curse in our country about the past, as if our past had to be erased and forgotten. But this is not like that. I would like to go back to a myth, to a legend, because myths are very important. When we go through uncertainties, myths help us better understand the story of man and the history of man. And which is the myth I want to refer to? Is the Aeneas myth. So, what does Aeneas do? Well, his hometown was destroyed. He cries. What does he do? Does he cry? Does he escape? Not at all. He takes his father and carries him on his shoulders, and the father has an urn with the ashes of their ancestors. And Aeneas decides to build a new city with the memory of the father and to do it with his son Ascanius. He has the new light required to establish a new city, and this is exactly what we are asked to do today during these difficult times. Thank you.
Ti chiediamo altri 5 minuti, possiamo?
Can we ask you another 5 minutes, please? Because thanks to your words, we have started some questioning, and in particular, to young people who read your essay, Democracies Without Memory. have a couple of questions for you. Would you be so kind to answer? The first one is from Lorenzo. It's a sort of humanist question. Well, it's a future-oriented question, and it links up with many things you said. I try to read to be clearer. In Italy, the trust and confidence vis-à-vis the parliament has reached 11%. Trust into parties is about 6%. Similar situation can be found in the US and elsewhere. Well, sorry, there was an off the mic comment from somebody in the audience. In spite of the fear generated by the recent cyber attacks, well, digital platforms would like to try to make their contribution to rekindle the confidence into institutions. Brian Ford from the Technological Institute of Lausanne, going back to the Greek tradition and trying to get inspiration from that. Imagine a sort of a delegation, a proxy-based democracy based on specific technological platforms, so that voters can express their votes if they feel to be competent enough, but if the subject is too complex, well, the system foresees the possibility to delegate your own vote to people you consider skilled enough. So it's not a representative democracy, but it is a delegative democracy. And it was different from our representative democracies. But thanks to this delegative democracy, you could change your delegate every time according to the topic being mattered. Considering the crisis of democracies, could we consider this scenario as possible or as advisable somehow in the future? Well, I'm a bit sort of worried by such a scenario. Well, certainly parliaments are going through a crisis, this is a fact. But this is also a problem of representatives. What do I mean by that? Contemporary societies are very complex and articulated entities. So what does a representative represent? And we know that this is a growing phenomenon, but this is also another issue. Who are the represented? And let's make an example. If we take foreign policies, so let's imagine that we have to decide whether to have a mission in Libya or not. And so, as many people know, many foreign policies aspects cannot be made public for security reasons, because of course you may jeopardize an entire operation and or mission by making it public. There are some things that need to be, let's say, kept away from the public because of their nature. And this is okay for some things like deciding whether to build a road or something like that. But for other matters, it's different. When it comes to relevant political choices, things are more complex and not so easy. Because you see, when things are complex, you need a representative. So the representative is not, somehow bypassed. So this solution probably has been designed for simple decisions. But as you said, you should have a change representative every time, but then you may have inconsistencies and major inconsistencies. So actually, I see this as very complex because direct democracy should be strengthened. Because if we consider a referendum, for instance, we see that things are quite complex because political parties used to take up political responsibilities and to be fully accountable for the decisions they made. But today things have changed. Well, some states in the US and also some cities in the Netherlands and in Canada, we have the recall option. What does it mean? That an elected representative can be recalled. And oh yes, Arnold Schwarzenegger, former actor, became governor of California because the previous governor was recalled. So somehow the recall option tries to respond to this kind of approach. Personally, I don't think that what you depicted could be easily applicable. Maybe that could be applied at a very small and local level.
The other question is actually quite different. It is asked by a person who graduated in scientific studies, nanotechnologies, Mr. Matteo Bertini, who will be asking the question. Good evening, President. Among the people who consider the limitations of the democracy and criticize it for this, there is also young people, that is, people of my generation. Now, acknowledging the limitations in that, I can consider that it is the best system. So how can my generation regain trust in this system where democratic aspects are having so many negative aspects, for example, emerging populism versus freedom of individuals? Well, I think that in part I have already answered to this question, but your question is right. So, a young person, how can a young person say, how can I have trust in the system? But what I ask myself is that young person able to know in detail the system, or does he or she just know the very superficial part of it? For example, I am very familiar with the life of the parliament, all the interventions. It is available on TV, for example. And what I notice is this, is that, for example, referring to the lower chamber, there is 40 MEPs that are just baggering about. They raise notices and insult colleagues. Then there's about 300 MPs from any kind of parties, right and left, that are serious, they are prepared, they know all the reports, they take the floor when it's time for them to take the floor, and nobody knows that they exist because they don't just show off. They don't just do emotional things. They're not there just to play jokes. They prepare themselves and they explain why things work or do not work for this and that region. They are boring. They don't entertain. So the first problem I believe is we should really understand well what we're talking about. I'm sorry to say this, but what we perceive is just a superficial layer hiding important things that are going on in our society. There was a time when in Italy there was a person killed by terrorists every single day. Now that time is over. We had very serious massacres by the mafia, and that also was stopped in a way. Now it looked like as if the economic crisis would have never ended, but now we know that we doubled exports compared to France, and we also surpassed Japan and other important countries. So companies in our country are working, and very soon there will be also beneficial effects on the labor market, not immediately but soon. So I believe that the answer to your question would be this, that is, others should worry about explaining very well what this country is about, what is behind the scenes in this country. Perhaps sometimes we may organize a conference and address the issue of self criticism. I do respect French and France and Germany, but we know about the scandal of Volkswagen and other car producers. We know how this scandal happened, but was this generated by someone who was paid to raise this problem? Well, the newspapers in Germany, and I normally read just one newspaper from Germany, but they just published a couple of news in the first page, the second page. The same was true for Peugeot in France. They didn't really make a big deal. If this had happened in Italy, we would have had weeks and weeks of newspapers full of this kind of news because we self criticize a lot. But this is a problem because it leads to a lack of responsibility. Because if everything doesn't work, why should I commit myself? Why should I make an effort? I am just against. If I am positive, I don't want to commit myself. If this is the world, such a terrible world, why should I commit myself? And this is a really terrible system. I want to thank you for this question because it raises a big problem referring to the fact that we do not necessarily have to say beautiful things about our country, but we need to tell the truth. It's not that by being very self critical, then we have to dismiss everything. So thank you for this question, but this tells us that we need to look into the reality of things much more than we are used to do, because we will find many more positive things. Italy wouldn't be where it is now without resources and capabilities. We would have crumbled long ago, and so many other countries would have been destroyed if they had gone through what we have gone through over the last 40 years. And you know what's the point? Because we are extraordinary when there is an emergency. But in everyday life, in the ordinary management of everyday life, there so and so, we are Mediterranean in this sense. I think this is part of the Mediterranean nature. I would like to close this conference by thanking warmly Mr. Luciano Violante. Thank you for the time that you have given us and the big research that you presented. And I stopped the applause because we're running really, really late. So first, thank you, Luciano. Then, second, since we are at the very beginning of the meeting, I would like to relaunch something. What we have listened to this evening is, I believe, a kind of provocative remark. It provokes us to experience this whole week at the meeting as an attempt to understand more and more how, why, and to what extent the crisis can be a way not to fall into darkness, but to go through to the next step, to the next stage. And as the question asked before, is Christianity a behavior? I think this has a lot to do with this idea of relaunching this attitude, as the crisis can be a passage, and we should understand more what we are within this passage. And the third point is the fact that doing the meeting, organizing the meeting, is a big effort, and it is possible to contribute to this effort by making a donation. In all the halls you will find some stands called Dona Ora, donate now, and it is important that these donations are made only at the dedicated desks, where you'll see our volunteers with a green t-shirt and with the writing Dona Ora on it. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.